Let's be honest, we all love buying new floral dyes, but one of the questions I hear all the time is how to get more mileage out of the dyes you already own. It's easy to create one card and then put a dye set away. But what if you could create completely different looks using the same supplies? Today I'm using these beautiful coneflower dyes to create two very different cards. Along the way, I'll share 5 simple techniques that can instantly elevate your die cut flowers and help you stretch your supplies even further. The first card is a clean and simple design, while the second one takes things up a notch with more color, texture, metallic accents, and dimension. Let's dive in. I've chosen some bright sunrise and sunset inspired colors for the 2 different looks today, and I'll be using the Coneflower edge dies for this project. Since these flowers are fairly large, I've decided to create 5x7 cards so the design has plenty of room to shine. For the sentiment, I'll be using the Big and Bold Sentiments die set. These are both newer die sets from Spellbinders, in case you're curious. Since this will be a very clean and simple card, I'm keeping the background minimal but interesting. The first technique is creating texture without adding extra layers or bulk. Instead of reaching for an embossing folder, I'm creating my own texture using score lines. This is a great way to add interest to a clean and simple design while keeping the focus on the focal image. I'll start scoring about 3/4 of an inch from the edge and create a series of score lines. That's really all the decoration I'm planning for the card front. I'll score every 1/8 of an inch and create about 7 score lines. My hand slipped and I ended up with a score line where I didn't want one, but I can easily fix it by simply rubbing over it a little. And since the flowers will be covering that area, it won't be very noticeable anyway. I'm also going to flip the panel over because I was being a little too gentle near the bottom edge. I want the score lines to be uniformly prominent across the top and the bottom. With the background finished, I'll set that aside and move on to the die cutting. I'll be cutting all of the flower pieces from plain white cardstock except for the small band around the flower center. That piece will be cut from gold cardstock. I'll be coloring the flowers in the next step. While I'm die cutting, I'll also cut the hello sentiment. I'll use the brushed gold cardstock for the word, and I'll use a bit of vellum for the shadow layer. Okay, all of the die cutting is done, and I've also prepared the sentiment. For extra dimension, I stacked 2 layers of plain white cardstock behind the gold hello die cut and then adhered the entire piece to the vellum shadow layer. The die set actually includes enough pieces to create 3 flowers, and I cut everything out. However, I only want to use 2 flowers on the card front to keep the overall look clean and simple. I've cut everything from Nina Classic Crest cardstock because I find it gives the most vibrant results when ink blending, and the second technique for this next step is ink blending directly onto die cuts. To make blending easier, I'm placing all the flower pieces onto my Altenew sticky mat. One of my favorite things about die cut flowers is that you don't need alcohol markers or advanced coloring skills to create beautiful results. Starting with white cardstock gives you complete flexibility with your color palette. For this card, I'm going with sunrise inspired colors using pinks, yellows, and oranges, but a little muted. For the flowers, I'll be using these 3 Gina K Designs ink colors. First, I need to make sure the petals are oriented correctly. The flower will droop downward, so I want to color it from the proper direction. I'll begin by adding dusty rose to the tips of the petals. And here's the best part. Because no 2 flowers in nature look exactly alike, this technique is incredibly forgiving. Some petals can have more color, some less, and the variation actually helps create a more realistic look. Next, I'll move on to wild dandelion and add yellow near the centers of the petals. finally, I'll bring in sweet mango around the flower centers. It's softening some of the yellow, but you'll still see that hint of yellow peeking through. And that's it for the flowers. I'll set these aside for a few minutes to dry while I work on the stems and foliage. By the way, I use some scrap white cardstock for all of these die cuts. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know I love using up my scraps. I'm definitely a scrap hoarder, so whenever possible, I like to conserve supplies and put those leftover pieces to good use. And speaking of supplies, if you're looking for a complete list of everything I'm using today, you'll find it linked in my blog post, which is linked in the video description below. Now let's move on to the stems and leaves. For this card, I really want that touch of gold in the flower centers because it ties in beautifully with the gold sentiment. For the foliage and flower centers, I'm using a mix of Altenew Hero Arts and Distress ink, basically greens I had available that worked well together. I'll begin with the lighter green and then add Hero Arts Field Greens to create some shading and dimension. The flower centers are finished as well. Assembling these flowers is really easy. These flowers are designed with multiple petal layers, and simply offsetting those layers creates a fuller, more natural looking bloom with very little effort. To assemble the flower, I'll simply add glue to the center and offset the petals so the second layer falls between the petals of the first layer. That creates a much fuller, more natural looking flower. Once the layers are aligned, I'll attach the flower center and add the leaves. Next, I'll tuck the stems behind the flowers and the leaves behind the stems and adhere them in place. I'll place a magnet over the flower while it dries and move on to the next one. Once the leaves are attached, I'll let everything dry for a minute before finishing the card panel. Now it's time to bring back the card front. Here's how I'm planning to arrange the flowers. The sentiment can either sit here or slightly higher, but I think I'll decide once the flowers are attached. I'll adhere the flower heads first and then slide glue underneath the stems without needing to move them. Here's the third technique, which is creating realistic dimension through selective gluing without the use of foam tape. When gluing the flowers and foliage down, I like to leave some of the petals and leaves loose while securing a few others. That gives the flowers dimension and movement while preventing them from catching on anything. Now I can decide that the gold hello sentiment will sit right here. I'll apply adhesive only where the die cut will hide it, so no glue shows through. Even the vellum shadow layer contributes to the overall dimension of the card. It's barely visible, but helps create a subtle shadow behind the sentiment without adding visual heaviness. The panel is now complete. All that's left is attaching it to the card base. I'm using a pre-made card base from Amazon. They are incredibly convenient and save me a lot of time. I'll adhere the panel, making sure to add a little extra adhesive behind the scored section. To finish the card, I'll add a few Spellbinder's opal gems. So for this first card, we've combined 3 simple techniques: scored background texture, ink blended die-cut flowers, layered floral dimension. The result is a clean and simple design that's elegant, detailed, and easy to recreate. As a variation, you can leave the die cuts white and add gold to the flower centers and add a gold sentiment. That would be an even cleaner look, but I wanted a little bit of color on this one. Now let's take those same flowers and push things a little further. One of the things I love about this die set is how versatile it is. By changing a few techniques and design choices, we can create a completely different style of card using the exact same flowers. Now let's move on to the second card. For this one, I'm taking things up a notch and creating a more artistic design. While the first card was clean and simple, I want the colors to be much bolder on this one. We're still using the same basic ink blending technique, but by switching the color palette to a slightly more intense one and adding a few more elements to the overall composition, the finished result will feel completely different from the first card. I'm starting with a saffron colored card base and a 6 3/4 by 4 3/4 indigo panel to represent the night sky. I wanted a narrow border around the card front so that the warm yellow cardstock peeks through and complements the flowers and gold accents. For the focal element, I'll be cutting a stitched oval using a Spellbinder's die. I'll also cut all of the flower pieces from white cardstock once again. All of the die cutting is finished, and this time I'm creating all 3 flowers. And here's the fourth technique, which is one of my favorites: adding metallic accents. Small touches of metallic cardstock, foil, or metallic pen details can instantly elevate a design and make it feel more polished. This brush gold oval panel will serve as an anchor for the floral arrangement, and I'll be adding a little more gold later as well. For this card, the colors I'm using are cherry pink and medium yellow, and I'm reusing the greens from the previous card. Since this card is inspired by sunset colors, I want the palette to be richer and more saturated. I'll begin with the yellow, concentrating it near the center of each flower and around the base of the petals. I'm intentionally applying more color than I did on the first card because ink blending tends to soften and lighten as it settles into the cardstock. I'll focus the pink near the tips of the petals and blend it inward slightly. This card is inspired by sunset colors, so I want the pinks, yellows, and oranges to feel vibrant and dramatic. The colors are looking beautiful already. I'm just making sure every petal has enough intensity and color variation. Again, because I'm using Neenah Classic Crest cardstock, it produces the most vibrant results when ink blending. If you haven't seen my video about 9 common card making mistakes, I highly recommend checking it out. In that video, I talk about how different cardstocks affect your coloring and ink blending results, and I show side-by-side examples so you can really see the difference. Another quick card option would be to start with colored cardstock and then add ink blending on top. In my case, I didn't have any suitable scraps, and I really didn't want to cut into full sheets of colored cardstock just to create more leftovers. Using white cardstock worked perfectly well. At this point, all of the pieces are ready to assemble. I'm going to start assembling the flowers, but I want to add a little extra detail. Since this card is more artistic, I'm going to use a gold pen to add tiny accents along some of the edge details, because one design tip I always keep in mind is repetition. If I'm introducing gold in one area of the card, I like to repeat it elsewhere. That's why you'll see gold in the flower centers, the sentiment, the oval frame, and eventually the splatter as well. Repeating an accent color helps create a more cohesive design. Just a few small touches of gold make a huge difference. I'll repeat the same process for the remaining flowers. Finally, the flowers are finished and they look absolutely beautiful. Let me zoom in a little closer so you can see the details. The gold accents add just enough interest without overwhelming the design. Now it's time to work on the background. Since we're using a sunset-inspired color palette, I want to incorporate some gold paint splatters, which brings me to the fifth technique, which is adding controlled splatter. Splatter is a fantastic way to add movement and visual energy to a card background. In this case, the fine gold splatter helps reinforce the warm sunset palette and keeps the large background panel from feeling flat. I'll spray a little water onto my gold paint and let it sit for a moment to activate. I'm using a fan brush, although honestly any brush will work. I just find that a fan brush creates more splatters with a single tap. Talk about being lazy. I need the mixture to be slightly more fluid, so I'll add a little more water. That's more than enough splatter for me, I think, because I don't want to overdo it. This is Spellbinder's Indigo cardstock, and I absolutely love how the gold glitter looks against the deep blue background. While the splatters dry, I'll begin arranging the flowers. I think this composition works well. And here's a bonus tip. When you're working with larger floral arrangements, press and seal makes it much easier to lift and move the entire arrangement without disturbing your composition. This is one of those simple tricks that can save a lot of frustration. Before attaching the arrangement, I want to secure the overlapping stems with glue so everything functions as a single cluster. Now that everything is secure, I'll add a few tiny foam squares behind the flowers. I don't want a lot of dimension, just enough to create some depth. I'm making sure none of the foam squares are visible from the front. Now the floral cluster is ready. I'll set it aside while I bring back the background panel. The splatters are dry now, so I can attach the gold oval. I'm mounting the oval flat against the background since I already have some dimension behind the flowers. Next, I'll position the floral arrangement and reinforce any areas that need additional adhesive. I'll also add a bit of glue behind the stems anywhere they make contact with the panel. This arrangement is looking gorgeous already. If I place the sentiment directly over the stems and leaves, it helps reduce some of the visual clutter in that area. I thought of trying the sentiment with a saffron shadow layer, but I think the white stands out a lot better. I'll add a few narrow strips of foam tape to support the parts not making contact with any of the card elements. That combination helps everything sit naturally across the different layers. I think that looks perfect. At this point, I don't want to add too much else to the panel. I'll adhere the finished panel to the card base using scrapbook.com glue because that gives me a little extra time to slide and adjust the placement. To finish the card, I added a few blue and yellow gems. What's really interesting is that both cards were created using the exact same die set, but by changing the techniques and overall design approach, they feel completely different. For the first card, we focused on scored background texture, soft ink blending, clean and simple dimension. For the second card, I added bolder color blending, metallic accents, gold splatter, and a layered artistic composition. It's a great reminder that sometimes you don't need more supplies to create fresh designs. Often, all it takes is approaching the same products with a different set of techniques. I'd love to know which card is your favorite, the clean and simple version or the more artistic design. Let me know in the comments below. I recently created a video on how to use vellum to elevate your cards, and you can watch that video here.